Hey everybody, welcome back. Freestyle Friday here. Keeping going with the old wrestling stories today. Today's episode of Freestyle Friday is Guilty by Association. Every time I think about this story, I kind of laugh. This was back 1989. Ricky and I had just started working a good bit with Daryl Van Horn as our manager. And he had gotten us booked with an organization called Atlantic Coast Wrestling, ACW. And the promoter of Atlantic Coast Wrestling, he was ahead of his time as far as independent shows go, as far as taking care of the boys and booking talent and promoting shows. I mean, he ran one of the biggest shows that we had seen on the independent scene, even though we'd only been in the business a little over a year. But they drew big crowds, and he treated everybody well, paid everybody good. And one of the things he did for us on this particular show, we happened to be wrestling for their World Tag Team Championship in the semi-main event, and he booked out the entire second floor of a motel right off of 26 going towards Charleston, right outside of Columbia. We did the show in a little town called Pillion. It was an outside show. But this is one of those shows that you kind of never forget, and there were several things about it. And one of the things was, number one, having a room that was paid for us by a promoter. Number two, having a pretty good guaranteed payday. I think we got a couple of $100 for that show, which at 19 years old, to do what you love doing on the independent scene, a couple of $100 was a dream come true. But then the coolest thing was, especially for a 19-year-old kid, was he rented limousines, and they would pick us all up at the hotel or motel and take us to the show and then bring us back. So, you know, we'd grown up watching some of our childhood favorites, obviously, and they were some of those guys booked on the show. The names that ring a bell for me were Wahoo McDaniels, Buzz Tyler, Ivan Koloff, and a couple others. But I'll just kind of speed through to kind of what happened. So it's an outside show, and he's got these really nice trailers set up for us to dress in and change in. And then we get there, and the trailers are pretty much stocked floor to ceiling with cases of beer, and there's an ice maker there. So everybody's just kind of throwing beers on ice. But so we get there to do the show. We had a really good match. We were the American War Eagles. They were the tag team champions, which was Rick Jacobs and Ralph Hodges. And Ralph Hodges, to this day, is one of the best workers I ever had the opportunity to share the ring with. The guy was just incredibly talented. He knew the business very well. He could bump and work and understood psychology, and basically could carry a great match. And Ralph did a couple of spots with WWE and WCW as a developmental talent or job guy. But just a really good guy and a lot of fun to work with. So we had a really good time in the match. After the match was over, we were making our way back to the dressing room. We were the heels, or the bad guys, if you will. So they were the hometown favorites, and we had made a lot of people mad. They were actually throwing hot dogs and drinks and rocks and whatever they could find at us. And so you really know that you've done your job as a heel when you infuriate the crowd that bad. And we have to give Daryl Van Horn the majority of that credit, because he was a very good mouthpiece, and obviously he went on to have a very good and successful career in pro wrestling with ECW and then WCW and TNA and on, and he's still very involved and doing a really good job. So he was really good at generating that heat, especially on those independent shows back then. Him being somewhat green too, he got a lot of cheap heat, but he could really just make people mad with some of the insults that he slung out and our attitude. But we were on our way back to the dressing area, and Buzz Tyler pulled me off to the side. He said, "Come here, kid," and really intimidated me. I mean, he's Buzz Tyler, you know, right? And so he calls me off to the side, and he says, "How in the hell do you expect me to go on after that?" He said, "You boys brought the house down. Y'all keep it up, man. Y'all doing good work." And that was one of the highest compliments that I had ever received in the business up to that point, even though obviously we were still very green. But here, Buzz Tyler, this guy that we'd grown up watching, call us off to the side and tell us that. That was really, really big for us at that time. So we go back to the dressing area, we changed, limos show up to pick us up to take us back to the motel, and the whole way back there, Ricky and Daryl and I are talking, and they're talking about the importance of when we get back to the motel, politicking. And what they meant by that was to go into some of these names' rooms. We'd been invited over to have a beer with these guys, and for us, the most important thing that we could do was to go in and get recognized by them and become part of the camaraderie that they were extending the offer to us for. And I was all for that, but I was a 19-year-old kid, and we'd had a couple of adult beverages on the house, and we made some good money. We had a great match. We got back to the motel, and these young ladies were hanging over the balcony, and they were screaming at us. So, being a 19-year-old kid on the road, just getting out of a limousine, having one of the best matches of my life up to that point, and getting a compliment by Buzz Tyler, I was on cloud nine. And now we've got these young ladies showing us some attention, and that kind of boosted my ego a little bit more. And so I wasn't too concerned with politicking anymore, but Ricky and Daryl did a good job of holding me to the flame and making sure that we went into Wahoo's room and hung out with him and Ivan and Buzz and the guys, and we had a good time and we enjoyed it. But I was more concerned with what those girls' motive for hanging over the balcony and yelling at us was. So I finally talked Ricky into walking down there with me. So we grab a 12-pack of beer for the road, if you will, and we go down, and I knock on the girl's door, and the girl opens the door, and when she did, I could see behind her, and there were two guys sitting on one of the beds facing the door. And I said, "Oh, I'm sorry, we got in the wrong room." Ricky said, "What do you mean we got in the wrong room?" I said, "Oh, we got in the wrong room, we got in the wrong room." And so I turned to walk away, and a hand reached around the door and grabbed me and snatched me into the room. Well, the cold beers that I had in my hand, I dropped and drew back to punch that hand, and then a badge came up right into my face. And he says, "I wouldn't do that if I were you." The next thing I know, they've got me up against the wall. They've got Ricky up against the wall. And long story short, we had walked in on an undercover drug bust at these girls' room. They were there kind of setting these guys up. And Ricky and I had never even seen any drugs at that time. Obviously, with our law enforcement careers later in life, we did have the opportunity to see drugs and the effect that they had on people. But at that point, as two 19-year-old kids, our highest drug was hard liquor, if we ever drank that, right? And so we were just mostly a couple of beer kind of guys. And anyways, they didn't believe that. They thought that we were there to buy some of the dope too. And even the girls kept trying to tell them, "No, that's not what they're here for. That's not what they're here for." But these officers, they weren't hearing that. They just couldn't believe that we coincidentally walked in on a drug bust. So they searched us up and down. They even took we both used to dip tobacco back then. They even took our tobacco cans and poured them out on the table and sifted through that to make sure we didn't have any dope on us. And one of the cops, he was just one of those guys, he was looking for that big bust, and just really an obnoxious guy and very offensive and trying to talk down to us and stuff. But he got a rile out of me, and I got a little bit of an attitude back with him, and so we kept going back and forth. Long story short, they decided that they couldn't charge us with anything except for possession of alcohol by a minor, because again, we were both 19 years old, and they were really pressing us to find out where we had gotten the beer from. And of course, I we're about to tell them that we walked out of Wahoo McDaniel's motel room with a 12-pack of beer, right? So, we kind of fudged and told them that we brought it from our house, stole it from our friend back in Lawrence or whatever the case was. And anyways, so they wrote both of us a citation and arrested us and charged us for possession of alcohol by a minor. And it had just turned into law that if you're under 21 and you got charged with possession of alcohol by a minor, you lost your license to drive for 30 days, 90 days, I don't remember now. But anyway, so they told us to make sure we brought our license to court with us. Well, Daryl and Ricky and I started talking after everything cleared up, and we were like, both of us can't lose our driver's license. And Ricky honestly didn't have any beer in his hand when we knocked on the door. So we go to court, and we walk into court, and the judge calls us up by name. And he calls me up first, and he asked me how I pled, and I pled guilty. I mean, I had a 12-pack of beer in my hand when the officers saw me, so I was guilty. And so he told me to have a seat, and he called Ricky's name, and Ricky stood up, and he looked around the courtroom, and he looked at Daryl Van Horn and myself, and he looked back at the judge, and he says, "Your Honor, I plead guilty by association." We bust out laughing. The judge wanted to get mad at us, but he was laughing so hard he couldn't even get mad at us. And finally, he comes to composure, and he calls the courtroom back to composure, and he asked me to stand back up. He said, Mr. Campbell, obviously you were with Mr. Regal at the time of this incident, right? And I said, yes, sir. He said, well, you realize he just threw your ass, the judge said, you realize he just threw your ass under the bus. He said, because Mr. Regal, I'm guessing that you claiming you're guilty by association, you're saying your friend had all the beer and you were just there, right? So, needless to say, Ricky didn't lose his license. We were able to continue our gauntlet around the Southeast and enjoy ourselves as the Lightning Express with Darrell Van Horn for a couple more years. I'll come up with a couple more stories to tell you guys, but I'll never forget being guilty by association. Hey, listen, I hope you guys have a great weekend. Thanks for tuning in. Please let me know if there's anything you want to hear about, anything I can do for you. God bless. Have a great day.